They branded me a defect long before I understood what that word meant. In a kingdom where a woman's worth is carved from bloodlines and heirs, I was told I carried nothing. No future, no purpose, no flame. The man who raised me didn't see a daughter, only wasted potential wrapped in flesh. He measured me in coins instead of affection, and when he realized he couldn't profit from my womb, he sold me. As if discarding a broken tool would cleanse him of shame. I thought my life had ended there, sealed in the fate of a barren, forgotten pawn. But destiny has a habit of bowing for no one. The night the Alpha King stepped from the shadows, I felt the air change, like the world had been waiting for him to rewrite it. He looked at me as if I were a prophecy rather than damaged goods, as if the lie stitched into my bones could be undone with one truth. With a single claim, swift, ruthless, undeniable, he shattered every rule that ever chained me. Now I stand on the edge of a fate I was never meant to touch. A future built not on the curse they forced on me, but on the impossible hope that I am more than what they taught me to fear. I am Savannah Reese, 22, and for the last few years my existence had been defined by a single, crushing word: barren. It was a lie, meticulously engineered and cemented by the man who was supposed to care for me. My home was the suffocating confines of the Shadow Creek Enclave, an isolated territory built around a deep, oppressive forest, where the rules of lineage and fertility were enforced with iron severity. Here, a female's worth was calculated solely by her ability to propagate the bloodline. My purported inability to do so made me less than dirt, a burden that even the desperate leaders of the Shadow Creek were eager to offload. The architect of this misery was Dalton Hayes, 54. His presence alone was enough to make the air thicken. Overweight, with slicked back graying hair that shone unnaturally, and eyes that were perpetually calculating, sharp, and empty of warmth. Dalton, my stepfather, had begun the systematic process known as the fabrication of the Barren defect years ago. He convinced the pack elders, and eventually, me, that I was genetically useless, a defective link in the chain. It was his way of consolidating power. By removing me as a potential heir-bearer, he could push his own legitimate, fertile relatives forward. He didn't just spread rumors. He fabricated medical notes, silenced witnesses, and leveraged the Shadow Creek Enclave's fear of weakness to make his lie universally accepted. The day he finally moved to profit from my perceived failure was the day I truly understood the depth of his covetous nature. I was no daughter. I was a commodity, and a damaged one at that. "You've caused enough trouble, Savannah," Dalton hissed, shoving a thick parchment document into my hands just moments before we departed. "This is the last time you will shame this family." The document was the transfer deed, a grotesque piece of official legal documentation listing me, Savannah Reese, as a barren liability and detailing the terms of my transfer. I was being sold to the Ironwood Pack, a distant, politically insignificant pack, known primarily for its harsh terrain and brutality. They were desperate for any female, even a barren one, to serve as a political pawn or perhaps a glorified servant. It was a fate worse than outright execution. The journey was long and silent, taking us away from the deprivation of the enclave toward the center of all pack politics, the Summit Citadel. This massive fortified structure, carved high into the mountain, represented absolute power and meticulous order. The air here was charged with authority, the ground trod by figures of immense political weight. This was the location chosen for the summit exchange and interception. The moment I was to be formally handed over, my escort delivered me to the grand hall of the Citadel. The room was vast, echoing with hushed negotiations and the scent of dominance. I stood trembling slightly, my small frame and pale blonde hair making me feel exposed under the heavy gazes. The delegates from the Ironwood Pack were exactly as advertised, harsh, scarred, and impatient. Their leader, a brute named Varric, barely looked at me, focusing only on the paperwork and the small sum of silver Dalton had negotiated. Dalton was puffing out his chest, savoring the finality of being rid of his problem. "The liability is transferred," Dalton announced, pushing me forward, practically forcing the transfer deed into Varric's hand. She is a good worker, despite her flaw. You will find no use for her bloodline, but she will obey. A wave of crushing despair washed over me. This was it, the end of any hope for a life of purpose or love. I closed my eyes, bracing for the ironwood scent to completely envelop me. Then, the atmosphere in the hall did not just shift, it shattered. A scent of absolute, untamed power, cedar, ozone, and something ancient and lethal, cut through the stagnant air. The chatter died instantly, replaced by a profound, reverent silence. I opened my eyes and saw him. Kingston Kingthorne, 30, strode into the hall with a presence that demanded immediate subjugation. He was towering in height, broad-shouldered, clad in dark leathers that emphasized his formidable physique. His dark, cropped hair framed a face set in a permanent expression of intense authority, and his eyes, intense amber eyes, swept the room, stopping abruptly when they landed on me. He was the Alpha King. His word was law, his power absolute. He moved toward the transaction table, not pausing until he stood directly opposite Dalton Hayes. Varric of the Ironwood Pack was frozen, trembling visibly. No one spoke. Kingthorne looked down at the transfer deed, his lips curling in distaste. He didn't touch the parchment. A barren liability. Kingthorne's voice was deep, resonant, and devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. Dalton, momentarily stunned by the king's unexpected presence, managed a slick nod. Yes, Your Majesty. A regrettable defect. We are simply disposing of a flaw in the lineage before it spreads. Kingthorne did not acknowledge Dalton's explanation. His intense amber gaze fixed solely on me. I felt exposed, stripped bare by his observation. He wasn't seeing a barren female. He seemed to be searching for something deeper, something hidden beneath the years of lies. The Ironwood Pack will not be taking this female, Kingthorne stated, the finality in his tone making it impossible to argue. Varric looked terrified, quickly bowing his head. As you command, Your Majesty. We apologize for the presumption. Dalton, however, was confused, greedy, and foolish enough to protest. Your Majesty, with all due respect, the transaction is finalized. She is worthless, sterile, unable to contribute to the future. She is barely useful as a servant. Why interfere? Kingthorne slowly shifted his focus back to Dalton Hayes. The air pressure dropped. You presume to tell me the worth of things in my kingdom, Hayes? Kingthorne's voice was dangerously low. Before Dalton could formulate a trembling reply, Kingthorne performed the unthinkable. He reached out, taking my wrist in a grip that was simultaneously possessive and protective, pulling me firmly to his side, claiming me in the most public and irreversible way possible. This was the marking ritual. In the center of the royal hall, with every high-ranking pack member bearing witness, Kingthorne lowered his head. I gasped, the shock overriding my fear. He bit down hard, right where my neck met my shoulder. The pain was searing, immediate, and overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by an electric surge of foreign power, a heat that traveled through my veins, purifying and defining me. When he lifted his head, a dark, complex symbol pulsed visibly on my skin, the royal mark. It signified absolute ownership and protection, shifting my status instantaneously from barren liability to royal mate. The air crackled with the sheer audacity of his claim. Dalton Hayes went slack-jawed, his face draining of color. He had sold a defective servant, and the Alpha King had just claimed a queen. She is mine, Kingthorne announced, his voice booming, and any documentation claiming otherwise is void. I suggest you retreat to your enclave, Hayes, and await my summons. I was immediately whisked away from the political arena and taken to the Citadel's medical wing. Under the King's direct order, royal healers initiated a swift and rigorous investigation into my health. Kingthorne was convinced that the Shadow Creek narrative was a malicious fabrication. He was unwilling to accept a claim of sterility, unless proven by his own infallible resources. The subsequent weeks were a blur of tests and anxious waiting within the luxurious confinement of the Citadel. The royal healers used ancient, powerful tools, and eventually located the fertility scroll, an ancient document or medical record that allowed them to map my internal landscape with absolute precision. The moment the head healer stepped into my chambers, her face alight with an expression of profound joy, I knew. My queen, she whispered, bowing deeply. "The lies are undone. The fertility scroll confirms not only that you are exceptionally viable, but you are currently carrying the king's future heir." The revelation of the royal heir exploded through the citadel like wildfire. It was definitive, physical proof that I was anything but Barren. Dalton Hayes's malicious deceit had been exposed not by my defense, but by my ultimate worth confirmed by the king's touch and the subsequent natural process. King Thorn found me shortly after, pulling me into a fierce embrace. His amber eyes, usually so intense with authority, softened slightly as he rested his hand gently over my lower abdomen. He sold damaged goods, thinking he was rid of a liability, King Thorn murmured against my temple, his pride palpable. But I received a mate with the potential to produce the next generation of royal blood. Dalton Hayes will learn that in this kingdom, truth always finds its way to the surface. My life was no longer defined by shame or the Shadow Creek Enclave's fear. I was protected, cherished, and irreplaceable. My value was undeniable, affirmed not by a deed listing my flaws, but by the burgeoning life growing within me, the physical shattering of every lie Dalton Hayes had ever told. I had been sold as Barren, but the Alpha King claimed me, and in his protection, I found my destiny, the mother of the future. The chapter of the Barren liability was closed, replaced by the certainty of the royal line. The confirmation of the royal heir had not only rewritten my fate, but had sent immediate, measurable shockwaves through the Summit Citadel. I was no longer Savannah Reese, the barren liability of the Shadow Creek Enclave, but the carrier of royal blood, the future mother of the kingdom. The royal mark pulsed faintly beneath the collar of my tunic, a constant source of warmth and absolute security, a physical rebuttal to years of Dalton's psychological torment. Kingston, always a man of immediate and decisive action, did not allow the joyful news to be merely a private celebration. He understood that the magnitude of this revelation and the malicious deception that preceded it required a public, unforgettable response. My value needed to be asserted, not whispered. In the days that followed the revelation of the royal heir, I moved through the massive, fortified structure of the citadel in a daze of protected privilege. The heavy silence that had previously followed me in the presence of pack members was replaced by profound, respectful reverence. The elders and high-ranking officials who had witnessed the summit exchange and interception now averted their eyes, humbled by King's unexpected claim and my subsequent, undeniable fertility. "Your worth was never in question, Savannah," King said one evening, his large frame filling the doorway of my chamber. He had been meticulously planning the final exposure. My instinct told me that Hayes was lying. He lacked the conviction of truth. But now we have proof, definitive and undeniable. He motioned toward a heavy, rolled-up parchment resting on a display pedestal, the fertility scroll. It was a tangible piece of ancient power, used by the royal healers to map my internal health, providing the incontrovertible evidence of my exceptional viability. That scroll, centuries old, stood as a silent witness against the modern greed of one man. "He thought he could use the fear of a defective lineage to rid himself of you and gain favor," King continued, his intense amber eyes hardening. "That fabrication will be his undoing. The fabrication of the Barren defect had been the bedrock of Dalton's power play. Now, that bedrock was crumbling, and King was ensuring the collapse was public and total. King had sent an immediate summons to Dalton, not phrased as a demand for explanation, but as a mandatory appearance to discuss the voided transfer to the Ironwood Pack. Dalton, ever covetous and blinded by his own arrogance, likely assumed he could negotiate compensation for his trouble, perhaps spinning a new lie about discovering my true condition just after the transfer. He would arrive expecting a negotiation table. He would find a judgment seat. 3 days later, the air in the main audience chamber of the Summit Citadel was thick with anticipation. This hall was normally reserved for treaties and major pack assemblies, but today it was set for a private, yet highly symbolic, confrontation. King sat on his carved throne, radiating absolute authority. I stood slightly behind and to his right, a visible, undeniable symbol of his authority and the future. When Dalton was escorted in, he looked slightly frantic but still puffed up, trying to maintain his semblance of control. His slicked-back graying hair seemed oily under the bright light of the citadel, and his calculating eyes darted around the room, searching for an angle. He immediately spotted me standing next to King, and his jaw clenched. "Your Majesty," Dalton greeted, bowing too quickly and too shallowly. "I trust this meeting is to finalize the unfortunate incident involving the Ironwood Pack. I assure you, Savannah's inherent flaw was widely known, and I bear no responsibility for your unexpected interference." King raised an eyebrow, a flicker of profound danger crossing his features. "Unexpected interference, Hayes. Everything in this kingdom is subject to my will. You seem to have forgotten that fundamental fact." Dalton swallowed hard. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I only meant that the circumstances surrounding the transfer of the Barren liability were—" "Barren liability," King repeated, cutting him off with a chilling lack of volume. "Let us discuss that liability." King motioned, and the head healer stepped forward, carrying the fertility scroll. She stood before Dalton, unfurling the ancient document slowly. Dalton's expression shifted from guarded negotiation to genuine confusion. "This is an ancient record, Hayes," King explained, leaning forward, his voice a low thunder. "It maps the biological reality of the female you dismissed as damaged goods, the reality you fabricated a lie about for years to gain selfish advantage." Dalton finally saw where the conversation was heading. His face turned a shade of sickly gray, the color draining away just as it had when King first marked me. I don't know what this document is, Your Majesty." The Shadow Creek Enclave's medical records were clear. The fabrication of the Barren defect was based on scientific consensus, Dalton stammered, desperately clinging to his well-woven lie. "Your consensus was based on forged documents and coerced testimonies," King countered smoothly. "My healers, using resources far beyond your meager enclave, have exposed every single point of your deceit." I watched Dalton, feeling a surge of power I had never known. For years, his deceit had crushed my spirit, defining my worth as zero. Now, in this pivotal moment of reckoning, his carefully constructed reality was dissolving before my eyes. The head healer spoke, her voice clear and carrying across the hushed chamber. "Dalton Hayes, the female, Savannah Reese, whom you labeled genetically defective, is not only exceptionally viable, but, according to our readings confirmed this week, she is already bearing the next royal heir." This was the climax. The breath rushed out of Dalton's body. The sudden total shock was beautiful and complete. The man who had sold me, believing he was selling worthless trash, was faced with the ultimate proof of his failure, the certainty that I was carrying the bloodline he had desperately tried to eliminate. He looked at me, his sharp eyes momentarily wide and unfocused. The political pawn he dismissed was now the untouchable royal mate, protected by the most formidable power in the land, and carrying the dynasty. "No, that's impossible," Dalton whispered, his voice cracking. "I made sure. The records." "Your records were irrelevant," King stated, standing up slowly. When King rose, he commanded every molecule of air in the room. He stepped down from the throne, coming to stand directly in front of the shaking man. "You leveraged the currency of life and lineage for personal gain, Hayes. You attempted to damage the royal line by misleading my subjects and interfering with destiny." King paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. "You sold damaged goods, believing you were rid of a liability, but you handed the Alpha King a priceless mate. The irony of your greed is magnificent. The transfer deed, the document listing me as a barren liability, was brought forward." King took the parchment and, without ceremony, tore it in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the polished floor of the citadel. "This contract is void, and you, Dalton Hayes, are voided of all influence and titles within this kingdom," King declared. "Your actions against my mate and the future heir constitute treason." Dalton tried to beg, tried to rationalize, but King's decision was absolute. He was stripped of his status and exiled, his wealth confiscated as restitution for the years of emotional damage and political maneuvering he had inflicted. The Shadow Creek Enclave, which had enabled his lies, would be placed under immediate royal oversight. I watched him being dragged away, a pathetic, defeated figure whose calculating nature had ultimately failed him against the genuine strength of truth. There was no hatred in my heart, only profound relief. The shame of being labeled barren, the deep wound Dalton had inflicted, was not just healed, it was obliterated by the confirmation of the life I carried. My story had officially transitioned from tragedy to destiny. King turned back to me, the intensity in his eyes softening into a fierce devotion reserved only for me. He placed his large, warm hands on my shoulders, drawing me close. "The chapter of the Barren liability is permanently closed, Savannah," King murmured, kissing my temple near the royal mark. The truth surfaced, as it always must. "You are the foundation of the future, and no lie will ever touch you again." In the safety of his arms, standing in the heart of the summit citadel, the central pillar of the kingdom, I finally understood my purpose. I had been sold for nothing, but claimed for everything. The value I possessed was not determined by a greedy stepfather's lies, but by the undeniable potential of the life growing within me, the ultimate proof that the Alpha King had been right all along. I was home, cherished, and forever secure in my undeniable worth. The lie was dead, and the royal line was confirmed. My destiny was fulfilled. The reverberation of the audience chamber doors closing on Dalton's wretched figure was deafening. I felt a tremor run through my body, not of fear, but of profound, complete release. For the first time in my life, the air I breathed in, the summit citadel felt clean, untainted by the residue of his malicious intent. Kingston remained standing for a long moment, watching the now empty space where his former subject had stood, his powerful presence still vibrating with restrained fury. The rage wasn't directed at me, but at the audacity of the lie that had attempted to damage not only my life, but the stability of his reign. He turned, and the intensity in his amber eyes was a tangible force. He didn't approach me with celebratory roughness, but with slow, deliberate tenderness, as if I were made of glass, though I had never felt stronger. "The lie is dead, Savannah. He will never return," Kingston stated, his voice now lower, carrying the warmth of absolute commitment. "Your freedom is secured, not merely by my claim, but by the truth you carry." I placed a hand instinctively over the gentle swell of my abdomen, a place where the life he spoke of was taking root. That life, still nascent, was the final devastating counter-argument to Dalton's decade-long deception. The sheer injustice of those years, the whisperings, the pitying glances, the inherent shame of being deemed defective, had been neutralized in one swift royal decree. "He tried to make me believe I was worthless, Kingston," I admitted, the old wound finally closing enough to touch. "He succeeded for so long. I thought being sold to the Ironwood Pack was the end of my dignity." Kingston stepped closer, enveloping me entirely within the shield of his massive body, his scent of pine and smoke grounding me. The Ironwood Pack would have discovered the truth eventually, though through brutal means. They would have paid for damaged goods only to find they held the kingdom's treasure. But that was never your fate. You were always mine. He gently took my hand, drawing me out of the main hall and into the private adjoining solar, a space of rich dark wood and heavy velvet, where political anxieties seldom trespassed. The head healer, having performed her duty with the fertility scroll, discreetly followed, carrying the document like a holy relic. "The political ramifications must now be addressed," Kingston said, settling onto a large leather couch and pulling me down beside him, keeping one hand perpetually resting on my thigh. The Shadow Creek Enclave provided the foundation for Hayes' lie. They allowed the fabrication of the Barren defect to take root out of fear and complacency. They will be placed under immediate and severe royal oversight. The structure that nurtured that cruelty will be dismantled. I nodded. I had no sentimental attachment to the Enclave. It was a place of shadows and old-world prejudices, ruled by a pervasive atmosphere of fear and deprivation. What of the records? The forged medical reports he used as evidence? Burned, the head healer confirmed softly. Every document tracing back to Hayes' deceit has been catalogued, photocopied for the Royal Archives as proof of treason, and then destroyed. The official record now states only one truth. Savannah is the exceptionally fertile royal mate, carrier of the next dynasty. The weight of that public statement settled on me. It was more than protection. It was a total rewriting of my personal history. I was no longer defined by Dalton's lie, but by the king's undeniable truth. Kingston turned his attention entirely to me. "Hayes leveraged your supposed defect because he understood the currency of fertility in this world. But he fundamentally misunderstood the currency of my rule. I value truth, not just utility. I claimed you because my instincts, my alpha instinct, told me you were mine. The discovery of the heir only confirmed the secondary political necessity. The primary reason, Savannah, was always you." His words struck deeper than the confirmation of the pregnancy. reaching the core of the insecurity Dalton had nurtured. I was not just a means to an end. I was the desired end itself. A deep sense of peace settled over me, a feeling so profound it bordered on euphoria. The shame was not just gone, it had been replaced by an unshakable confidence. I looked around the meticulously ordered citadel, realizing this fortress was now my home, a sanctuary built of stone, steel, and absolute power. Kingston shifted, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that promised forever. He reached up, his thumb brushing over the faint warm site of the royal mark on my neck. The marking ritual had been the pivotal moment, the instant I transitioned from disposable property to irreplaceable treasure. I know the deceit ran deep, Savannah. Even with Hayes gone, the ghost of his fabrication might linger. Kingston murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I need you to look at me. Look at the reality of our shared future, and know that no one, past or present, can question your worth again. I met his gaze, my striking green eyes clear, free of the residual doubt that had clouded them for years. I saw the fierce devotion in his amber gaze, the promise of unwavering protection. I believe you, Kingston, I said, the words genuine and true. The pain is finally receding. He sold a liability, but you saw the potential. You saw me. Kingston smiled, a rare, breathtaking display of affection that softened the hard lines of his authoritative face. He drew me closer, ensuring no space remained between us. I saw destiny, he corrected softly. The rest of the day was spent in quiet deliberation and intimate planning. The Shadow Creek Enclave was already feeling the sting of the royal decree, but Kingston was not focused on retribution. He was focused on restoration. He ordered resources diverted to the Enclave, not to reward them, but to ensure the pack members who had been oppressed by Dalton's greed were cared for. He proved that his justice was measured, not merely vengeful. Later that evening, in the luxurious private chambers Kingston and I shared within the highest reaches of the Summit Citadel, I felt the final, ultimate emotional release. I stood before a large window, looking out over the expanse of the kingdom. It was vast, formidable, and entirely under his dominion. I was the core of that dominion now. Kingston approached from behind, wrapping his arms around me, his large hands resting securely over my stomach. The warmth of his body permeated my tunic, mingling with the internal, growing heat of the air within. That life inside you, Savannah, Kingston said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. It is the definitive physical proof. It is the final nail in the coffin of that malicious lie. I leaned back against him, closing my eyes, allowing the profound security to wash over me. I wasn't just Savannah Reese, the female rescued from an ignoble fate. I was the royal mate, the one who carried the lineage, the one chosen by the Alpha King himself. The transfer deed was gone, torn to pieces. The fertility scroll was safely archived, confirming my value. Dalton was exiled, his deceit exposed for the entire kingdom to witness. The shame that followed me was utterly extinguished. There was no ambiguity, no lingering doubt. My story was not a tragedy that ended with rescue. It was a destiny that began with true love and absolute acceptance. The Alpha King had claimed me, proved my worth beyond measure, and in doing so, had secured the future of his kingdom and, more importantly, the healing of my heart. The truth was, Kingston hadn't just claimed a viable mate. He had claimed the woman who was finally whole, cherished, and forever secure. I had been sold as nothing, but I was found to be everything. The lie was dead, and the royal line was confirmed, cradled safely in the arms of the king, high above the world in the Summit Citadel, where our future was now undeniably written. My destiny was fulfilled. Thumbs up this video, and subscribe to the squad.